1970s was the era of order and methodological business of advertisement and consumer culture. Although the industry had quite a slow start in the first half of the decade, the industry boomed towards the end, developing and structuralizing the industry as a whole. US total ad billings by 1979 reached $27.9 billion, which was triple that of the beginning of the decade. Pragmatic methods of accounting, billing, and reporting were followed to regulate productive tools utilized in making decisions at the business end of the companies. In comparison, the 1950s focused on the product and the 1960s honed in on the image and impression, while the 1970s used positioning as its prominent ad strategy. The use of computer technologies changed the way the advertisement agencies ran, as it allowed them to spend more time understanding research and statistics. Two key strategies that clearly show the links to the greater acknowledgement and understanding of target audiences and the data behind them are the increase of diversity in advertisement and the approach of comparative advertising.
I'd like to buy the world a home and
One of the objectives of the advertising business during the 1970s was an effort to increase diversity within the professional ranks in the industry and among the people portrayed in the advertising campaigns. This reflected a trend that grew out of the 1960s in American culture to demonstrate greater sensitivity to gender differences and ethnic minorities. The ad industry in the 1970s worked to improve diversity in advertising itself and within its own ranks. Some progress was made in ad content, with African Americans appearing in only 5% of TV ads in 1967, which increased to 13% in 1976. Slow progress was also made in the employment arena. Between 1970 and 1975, minority employment at 24 of the largest agencies rose from 8.9% to about 10% overall. Although at the mid and top management levels the percentage was lower and actually decreasing, and a number of individuals pursued employment discrimination suits against agencies during the 1970s, making it a very litigious period for the industry. At the tail end of the civil rights movement, the industry began to move away from its decades-long habit of portraying African Americans almost exclusively in positions of servitude or inferiority, as props in ads aimed at white audiences. By the 1970s, companies such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola began increasing the racial diversity depicted in their campaigns. In 1974, Jell-O became one of the first big companies to hire an African-American spokesperson, Bill Cosby. The goal was twofold for corporations: to keep up with the times and to broaden their potential consumer base. Although the way many agencies went about this demonstrates how little they understood about their target demographic, and the results, like so many vintage ads, appeared deeply misguided to modern audiences. To McDonald's, for example, appealing to African American consumers specifically meant in part ads such as Mackinac and Dinner Time'n, which made extensive use of G-dropping. Ads featuring Caucasians from around the same time, meanwhile, left out lines like, "On the real, kids can really dig getting down with McDonald's," and the insidious M. Charlton McIlwain, an associate professor at New York University who specialises in race and media, viewed these tone-deaf ads as the outcome of advertisers trying to do the right thing, but not necessarily knowing what that meant. White-dominated ad agencies lacked a general familiarity with blacks and black communities, leading them to design ads that were racially naive and necessarily relied on stereotypes for lack of any other information. Neil Drossman, an executive creative director and partner at his own ad agency, agreed, calling the McDonald's ads a really cynical and superficial effort to reach a black audience. Drossman, who began working in New York ad agencies in the 70s, said he remembers his firm working on an ad featuring a black couple and being asked if it looked too urban. According to Drossman, most of the industry's missteps resulted from an ignorance on behalf of mainstream ad companies, though there were and are specialised black agencies, but the general failure in tone was something that even the conventions of the era can't really excuse. What differentiated the good agencies of that period from the big bad ones, who were the majority, was a respect for the target and a desire to understand it, Drossman said. Advertisers knew empirically that African Americans were more likely to buy a product when they saw themselves reflected in ads, so targeted advertising made sense. But agencies also worried that products would become branded black, losing them their white consumers as a result, which turned out to be a misguided fear. Demographic targeting continued to flourish, and by the end of the decade, blacks made up around 12% of models in commercials compared to 3% in the mid-1960s. If micro-targeting is a legacy of 1970s advertising industry shifts, then so is the casual or symbolic racism that inevitably resulted. As the sociologist Anthony Cortese noted in his book, Provocative Images of Women and Minorities in Advertising, stereotypes of black and ethnic minorities have not been eliminated but have changed in character, taking subtler and more symbolic or underhanded forms. While advertisers took depictions of African Americans more seriously, other minorities were left out, largely because they had no significant spending power and weren't worth pursuing. Not only did advertisers regurgitate stereotypes, but they also helped invent new ones. The 1970s also marks the beginning of advertisers targeting minorities in vice-related categories. Think alcohol and cigarettes, especially menthol, which companies such as Winston branded as real and rich and cool, as middle-class white consumers began kicking their smoking habits in the 70s. Agencies began advertising for cigarettes in predominantly black communities at 2.6 times the rate of white communities.
Another major change within consumer culture in the 1970s was the adoption of competitive advertising. Brought as a major push by the US Federal Trade Commission for advertisers to create more informative advertising by making known brands highlight comparisons with its competitors. This was thought to give brands an opportunity to differentiate themselves from their competition by giving the public facts that indicated characteristics and made their products superior. What started as a way for brands to highlight their advantages soon became a forum in which to discredit its competition. Advertisers lost focus on its strategies and often presented misleading and false information about its competitors. This led to legal challenges under the Lanham Trademark Act that, put simply, prohibits the use of false descriptions or trademark dilutions of a product. In doing this, advertisers had harmed their institution's veracity, and consumers did not connect with the messages being produced. These competitive advertising attacks sparked what was called advertising wars. One of the biggest advertising wars established in the 70s was between soda conglomerates Coca-Cola and Pepsi, which ignited a rivalry that continues to swing punches today. Originally, Coca-Cola presented the soft approach with their It's the Real Thing campaign in 1972, trying to divert customers from any imitations.
It's a real thing. Coke is. That's the way it should be. Coca-Cola. Something the world wants to see. Oh yeah, the real thing. Coca-Cola. It's the real thing. Coca-Cola is Coke.
It was actually underdog Pepsi who threw the first big hits when they took to the streets with their Pepsi Challenge campaign in the mid-70s by doing blind tests of both products.
We asked these students at Tulane University to have a little fun conducting their own Pepsi Challenge. Sure surprised a lot of them, like Cornelia. Pepsi. And Kevin. Pepsi. And Holly. Pepsi. And Carla. This is the same kind of test we gave people all across the country. And nationwide, more people prefer Pepsi over Coca-Cola. Pepsi. People who let their taste decide pick Pepsi.
It surprises me that two colas can taste so differently.
Other advertisers took competitive advertising into a more interesting direction, like the Uncola campaign from 7-Up. This successful campaign framed themselves as the ultimate oppositional drink by focusing on what makes them different to the top soft drink brands. Creating an interesting brand identity while also making subtle hits of comparison with its competitors made this a strong representation of a successful comparative advertising.
These are cola nuts. They grow here. They're used to make cola-flavored soft drinks. These, on the other hand, are uncola nuts. They grow here too, but as you can see, they're a bit different from cola nuts. Rather larger for one thing, rather juicier too, I'd say. Marvelous little things, uncola nuts. We use them, of course, to make the uncola 7-Up. It's the uncola nut that helps give the uncola its je ne sais quoi, fresh, clean taste, no aftertaste, wet, wild, all that. Marvelous, absolutely marvelous. Just try making something like that out of a cola nut. Why, it's even prettier than a cola. Nuttier than a cola, actually.
The 1970s was a key era in the evolution of consumer culture as we know it today, taking what was a loose and relatively new industry and turning it into the strategic mass of an industry it is today. Although it was not without its imperfections, without the introduction of analytics and research, the industry would not have boomed in the way it did at the end of this decade, and these two strategies were key components in making that happen.